Hey, everybody. Today I've got an amazing guest. Marcus Eriksen is research director and co founder of the Five Gyres Institute and recently co founded Leap Lab. He's regarded as, by many people, as the world's number one expert on plastic pollution. He has studied, I think you've been studying it for 40 years or close to that. He studies the global distribution and ecological impacts of plastic pollution, and his studies have included over 20 expeditions sailing across all five ocean basins: the Bay of Bengal, the Southern Ocean, the inland lakes and rivers, and publishing the first global estimate of all plastic of all sizes floating in the world's oceans in 2015. And I think that was the year that you built that very strange, it looks like a catamaran in the pictures out of junk. It
It
looks
is.
like
It's
it's sinking in all the pictures that I've seen of it. It's hard to believe that you sailed it across the ocean, but
and it was sinking.
it was sinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On day three, I called my wife from sea on a satellite phone and said, "Hey, babe, we're sinking." And she organized not quite a rescue mission, but she rescued us by sending us more supplies. I had to reinflate all the bottles and get some additional twine to hold the pontoons together. It was a pile of junk. And the intent was, you know how nonprofits work. You want to get ahead of the game. We're doing research, still around the world, but to grab the public's attention, you're competing for attention. We made a homemade raft, 15,000 plastic bottles, and we put an airplane on top of it, a Cessna 310 aircraft. I think it's the first airplane to drift across the ocean from Los Angeles to Hawaii. An unexpected 3 months. But thought it would take 3 weeks with no motor, no support vessel. We're just at the mercy of the waves. But we made it, and it worked in terms of a PR stunt. It really helped us, capture more eyeballs and more attention to the issue of ocean plastic pollution.
And what was the airplane for? That was your rescue craft?
That was my cabin. It had no wings. It was just a fuselage, and yeah, that's what we lived in for 3 months. Me and my co-navigator Joel Pascal, the two of us lived in this thing. And my wife, Anna Cummins, she was mission control. She was saying, here comes another hurricane. Stay north, get out of the warm water, get in the cold water where the winds die down a bit. It was much more than I bargained for. But, because I survived, it's a great story to tell.
It looks like it probably had a maximum of like 3 knots, if that. It did not
On a good
let me
day.
put it this way, it did not look either aero or hydrodynamic, but I cannot believe you sailed that thing across the ocean.
Sailing is a very kind word. It was really just drifting. So we averaged 1.5 knots. I mean, I could have walked to Hawaii faster, really slow. But we were able to make a bunch of little short videos. I was making 30-second videos at half a megabyte. But there's one video in particular that really caught everyone's attention. And it's an image of a fish that I caught. I mean, we were down to eating peanut butter and fish by month 2. And I caught this one little rainbow runner, about maybe 12 inches long. And I filleted it. I was going to eat it. I opened the stomach. The stomach was very tight. It was expanded and tight. I touched the knife onto the stomach and it burst open, and 17 particles of microplastic, each one the size of a grain of rice, popped out of its gut. I was really in the middle of nowhere. And an animal that I was just looking for sustenance. And this middle of nowhere, our trash was impacting marine life. It made me really realize that, the plastic pollution issue, it really is global. Every corner of the planet has our trash, and it's increasing. The number of particles are getting smaller, they're fragmenting, and they're getting into everything, including you and I.
I want to talk about that. I want to ask you another question about that fish, though, because when you're out in that blue ocean going very slow, the fish actually congregate up under your craft, right? Or were you actually fishing with hand lines
We
and
were we did some hand line fishing, not much. We didn't see many fish. Actually, I met one sailor who had done a similar voyage on a wooden raft back in 1958. And he told me stories of seeing sharks every day, seeing tuna and mahi mahi and ono, all these fish. We didn't see any sharks, any tuna, any ono. We caught, I think, 16 mahi and mahi. That's it in 3 months. As you indicated, they do swarm under your boat. So we were always able to jump in and get mahi-mahi using a spear gun, spearfishing. There were other smaller fish hanging around, but largely the ocean was empty. So that's a whole other issue besides, microplastic pollution is overfishing. The exploitation of fisheries in international waters is kind of off the charts, happening everywhere and depleting fish stocks. But yeah, plastic pollution, I was really surprised to find that inside the gut of a fish, I was 1,000 miles from land in all directions, and there it was.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the worrying things is the plastics that you can't see, the microplastic that may also be in that fish. You've done this peer-reviewed publication. I think there's 11 other authors on it. And this was published on March 8th, 2023. And it is trending all over. It's probably the lead trending environmental article at this point in time. And the title of it is A Growing Plastic Smog, now estimated to be over 170 trillion plastic particles afloat in the world's oceans. Urgent solutions required. Tell us about that.
This was the culmination of really a lifetime of work. Over 20 years I've put into this. Ever since grad school, went right into this career path. And I've met some really amazing scientists. So on that paper, it was well crafted as a science study. And I'm very proud of it. We had 3 generations of scientists. I was able to invite Captain Charles Moore, the person who discovered the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and then Ed Carpenter, the first person to publish anything on plastics back in 1972. Got him on board. And then this other fellow, Robert Day, he was publishing in the early 80s. And I asked him, do you have any hidden data? He had a little clipboard, a little folder of data unpublished from the 1980s. So we added his data to the pot. We took every published studies in the last 40 years, put that together, and took my studies from 20 expeditions. And we were able to put together 11,600 data points in the ocean over 40 years of time in every ocean to create this time trend. So we're looking at how has plastic pollution in the oceans changed from the 1970s, late 70s, 1979, until 2019, a 40-year time trend. I mean, it was hard to find data for every single year. And in some cases, we couldn't. I would say, looking at that 40-year time trend, those first 15 years until about the 1990s, early 1990s, we didn't have a whole lot of data. So our data shows not much change, but we're not very confident in that data. The middle section, though, from 1990 to 2005, much better data, but it's kind of staying level. The amount of trash is increasing a little bit, but not at such a rapid rate as we saw recently. So since 2005 until present, what really surprised me was this exponential increase in the amount of microplastic on the ocean surface. From 2005 to present, it went from no more than a few trillion particles to 170 trillion particles on average. And I'm not talking like 170 trillion bottles or bags or large items. We're talking microplastics, things less than the size of a grain of rice. So what we've noticed is that the trash that's out there, older trash and the new trash going in, it's falling apart, it's fragmenting, it's turning into what we call in the paper a smog. Almost like the way we look at smog over our cities, air pollution, little small particles creating clouds of pollution over our cities, that's highly toxic. The same thing for plastics. We've got this growing accumulation of microplastics, micro and now nano, creating these clouds, these plumes of microplastic particles by the trillions in every water body, hovering over the centers of oceans. And each particle carries its own burden of toxicity. It's absorbing chemicals. It might have some chemicals already attached to it from production. Then it's absorbing like DDT, pesticides, won't mix with water, but sticks to plastic. PCBs, PAHs, industrial chemicals, they don't mix with water, but they stick to plastic. So you get this growing smog, again, these plumes, these clouds of plastics forming in our oceans. And our paper really got the best data available, the best modeling to come up with that big number. But what we do in the paper, we talk about, why? Why do we think this growing smog of 170 trillion particles is happening? We think there are 3 reasons. One is that what's out there is just getting smaller. It's fragmenting and fragmenting and fragmenting. One plastic bag can make 10,000 microplastic fragments, but then also increased production. In the last 15 years, we produced well over 5 million tons of new plastic. And with new plastic comes more pollution as well. Then the third thing, and this is really interesting, the third thing, if we look at the policy landscape, like what were the international agreements over this 40 years? Back in the 1970s and 80s, during the environmental movement of that time, you saw some really good international policies, like dumping at sea. Many countries would take their trash offshore and dump it. MARPOL Annex 5 was maritime law in the 80s that made that illegal worldwide. And every country had to comply because it was legally binding. It wasn't like a voluntary thing where, oh, maybe we'll comply or not. Legally binding, and it worked. And there were several legally binding, treaties. What we saw from the 1990s, let's say towards the millennium and onward to present, the legally binding treaties begin to fall to the wayside, and industry wins the argument of making them voluntary. Voluntary policy does not work. When a company has to choose between its bottom line or a choice whether to comply or not, they'll often just go with the bottom line and not risk losing profit or competitive edge. So voluntary measures in the last 20 years, they haven't worked. And I'm sure it's a combination of all three things. It's fragmenting, more production, and really poor policy that's responsible for this exponential increase in microplastic in the world's oceans.
When you say they were legally binding, how does that work? Was there an enforcement agency? Were there penalties? Because that's always a problem with a treaty. How do you make it enforceable?
Yes, and I'm not totally familiar with those, with what the enforcement measures are. I don't know if there were tariffs or some kind of penalty associated with those policies. With MARPOL Annex 5, you would get penalized and you would not be able to operate your fishing fleets if you were
okay. Well, that's a very, very stringent penalty and one that everybody would pay attention to.
And there's incentive to comply if there's a penalty. If there's no penalty, the compliance really falters.
And how does this affect all of the different, the food chain in the ocean, the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, and then up to the kind of the, larger predators and the grazing fish and ultimately the marine mammals?
That's a really good question. And I often get the question, does it matter? If there's a smog of plastic out there, is it a benign material? And the answer is no, it's not. So what we know is that microplastics, they act like sponges and they accumulate, as I mentioned before, pesticides, under other industrial chemicals, PAHs, PFAS, all these things will stick to plastic. Anything that's hydrophobic, doesn't mix with water, can be lipophilic and stick to plastic. So one little particle of plastic can become this little toxic pill. And as organisms ingest it, and you have to consider that most of the ocean is being filtered through marine life very quickly. Within a matter of months, the first 100 feet of the ocean surface is passing through some organisms somewhere. The trillions of organisms, the planktonic organisms, all the way to marine mammals, are all ingesting and filtering out this water, and they're taking the microplastic with it. So what we're seeing in some cases is that as animals ingest plastic, their body chemistry, the soup in their stomach of enzymes and so forth, can sometimes pull those chemicals off of plastic, and then those get ingested into the animal's body. We have seen that happening. So that's the ingestion intoxication from plastics. But there's also entanglement. A lot of entanglement happens from organisms eating trash or getting tangled in everything from the plastic bands around boxes that remain this little circle that can trap animals. I've seen those around sea lions, for example, to big fishing nets. There's no shortage of images on the web of whales with their tails wrapped in plastics, or sea turtles with their limbs amputated by having fishing line around them. So it's entanglement and ingestion are some of the harms. But we're also seeing this on land. So while my work has been oceans focused, the issue isn't. The issue is really looking at every single biome. I have colleagues that found microfibers on top of Everest in the Alps. I have colleagues that have found plastic pollution in the deepest trenches of the ocean. In fact, James Cameron, in his deep sea vessel, he was able to document plastic trash down the bottom of the Marianas Trench. I recently, a few years ago, I went to Dubai. I was there doing work. I was going to work in the Persian Gulf in that water body and survey for microplastics. We're finding lots of pre-production pellets, the raw feedstock for plastics. And I'm in Dubai, and I meet this veterinarian. Really interesting man. He had been given, I think, 50 million bucks from Sheikh Mohammed to build the best camel hospital on the planet. And he looked at me and he said, if you want to see the impact of plastics, you got to come with me. So we drove about 60 miles into the desert. We were going over these rolling hills, and there's acacia trees all over the place, beautiful landscape. There are a few fences I saw covered with plastic trash blowing across the desert. We get to one ridge, look over the edge, and there are a few little piles of white bones here and there. And he said, that's normal. Animals will come out here. The herd passes through. One gets left behind and dies. The bones stay. We went down to one and he said, let's dig. I said, what do you mean, let's dig? He begins digging inside the rib cage. You can imagine like this skeleton, it's belly up. The ribs are sticking out of the ground, like in little rows. So inside the chest cavity, we're digging right there. And we start seeing plastic trash. And I began to wonder, what is this? How did this get here? How much is going to be here? We kept digging and digging. We pulled out a mass that was roughly, I'd say, 50 kilograms. This huge thing, about 80 pounds, this big, massive wad of plastic bags. And we went to 5 skeletons, pulled out 5 of these things. I've got them here in my garage because we published on it. He had observed in his career over 300 camels died in his hospital due to ingesting plastics. We published this paper about the plight of plastics, of camels eating plastic waste. And it was kind of a horror story, the way these animals suffer from this. You can imagine, like right now, if you had 20 bottle caps and 30 plastic bags in your stomach, you couldn't pass it, couldn't regurgitate it. The suffering, the stress on your esophagus and your stomach lining, sepsis from bacteria in there, and the false sense of satiation. You feel you're full when you're not, and you're malnourished, you dehydrate. So he saw this happen to hundreds of camels. We published this paper, and I'm proud to say within a couple of years, less than 2 years, Dubai banned plastic bags and found a reasonable alternative in a different material. Again, the issue, it's really global. It's impacting a lot of organisms from the middle of the desert to the bottom of the ocean and everywhere in between.
One of the concerns that I've worked on for many years and that we have in the United States, because I've been focused a lot on endocrine disruptors and the phthalates and BPAs in plastics. And we're seeing these anomalies, which are no longer anomalies, but in sexual development in boys and girls, but particularly girls getting, nowadays it's commonplace for 9 and 10-year-olds to get their periods. And a lot of that, it's clearly coming from endocrine disruptors. The most common vector of exposure is, are these different plastics. And whether it's from plastic water bottles or all of the things that we eat that are packed in plastic that absorb a lot of those chemicals from the plastic wrapping, even organic food that is stamped, the food that's stamped, that the, BPAs travel from the ink, travel into the, through the plastic they leach through, they get into the organic food. Is that something that you look at all? Just the exposure, the human exposures.
I was on a paper probably 15 years ago, early in my career, with a fellow last name Bomsal. And Bomsal was a scientist who kind of blew the lid off of BPA. He got a lot of pushback from industry about BPA, bisphenol A. And he had seen, some endocrine disrupting features in the mice he was studying. He was studying mice for a different reason, but it was the Lexan pans where he had the mice living and the water dishes that had BPA that were causing these effects. He didn't know where they're coming from until he realized, oh, it's the plastic. So I'm really glad that you brought this up. It really is an issue. In addition to, plastic pollution, we have a lot of issues with the kind of chemicals that are on plastics. That are plasticizers and additives. Things like, as you mentioned, bisphenol A and phthalates. Phthalates are common in children's toys. Like what makes a rubber ducky a flexible rubber are phthalates. It can be up to 50% by volume can be this chemical phthalates. Phthalates is an endocrine disruptor. If you're giving your kid a soft chew toy with phthalates, you're giving them an endocrine disrupting popsicle to chew on. Bisphenol A is another one. Bisphenol A, as you know, is an endocrine disruptor. It's inside the lining of all of our metal cans. The reason why metal cans don't rust from the inside is a thin layer of plastic on the inside. And very often that is bisphenol A. You mentioned, organic food is packaged in plastic. when it's packaged in plastic, can we still call it organic? Why do we not have these kinds of labels for our packaging as well? When we're consuming foods that are adjacent to this packaging for sometimes months or years on the shelf, they absorb what leaches out of that packaging. So I think there's a need, and I'm so glad you pointed this out, that some of these endocrine disrupting chemicals, they render our organic produce in some cases inorganic. It would take away that designation because of the volume of endocrine disrupting chemicals on that packaging.
Yeah, and we've been trained to accept that packaging and to desire it, so that it's unusual for an American to go into a grocery store, even to a Whole Food, and pick carrots out of the bin or unwrap the food that is mainly maybe oddly shaped, that is not uniform, and that is not wrapped. Doesn't really seem like real food to us anymore.
It is a strange thing. I often talk about, we had to be trained to be throwaway consumers. If you think of how our American culture was during the Great Depression, my grandparents wouldn't throw a thing away. They even washed their plastic bags in the 70s. And also World War II, we were a culture of conservation for the war effort. We recycled everything. There were paper drives, there were metal drives, there were victory gardens. So post-World War II in the 50s, we had to be taught planned obsolescence and to buy and then wait a few years until it's dysfunctional or unfashionable and then buy again. That changed. So yeah, I love that you observe that part of American culture, but it's only in the last 100 years that we flipped from a culture of conservation to a culture of planned obsolescence and throwing things away. But I think there is an opportunity, and what makes me optimistic is that I see the change happening, not going back to any semblance of inconvenience, but getting smarter about our packaging and the materials and our delivery systems, the business models for delivering goods to customers. That there's so much innovation and entrepreneurship out there that it leaves me somewhat optimistic, cautiously optimistic.
And what do you think the solutions are? What are you targeting? I mean, what's your dream for legislation or other solutions?
Well, I think it's a few things. I think, first of all, we have to realize that there's going to be no silver bullet solution. So one thing we've been communicating lately is we want to solve this issue, one industry at a time. I've been to so many conferences where there's one person sitting at the same table as me that's really focused on just fishing gear, plastics and fishing gear. One person focused on e-waste. One person focused on medical waste. Another person on car tires. I'm on oceans and single-use plastics. And it's almost like a Tower of Babel. So I think first thing is to look at our individual sector, because each sector, it's a different chemistry, different polymer, different additives. It's a different societal use of that product, different ways it gets in the environment, different impacts it might have. So the solutions are going to be very different per sector. And then I'm also seeing there are folks looking at each sector, but then looking upstream rather than the downstream. Let's just clean it up and let's just recycle more, which is unfortunately that fails. I love to talk about that. More preventative measures. We're seeing cities eliminating from their communities the kinds of plastics that are the most costly to those cities in terms of cleanup and waste management and pollution leaving those cities. So a lot of cities are, for example, eliminating things like straws and bags and utensils and cups and cup lids, and they're favoring things that are a little more benign by design, a little more environmentally friendly, easier to compost. So we're looking at better systems for how we move materials to consumers without the legacy of waste. We're seeing some better waste management. Then we're seeing something else I like, and that is the reuse economy. Every time I go to a city now when I travel, it's not difficult to find a reuse station where you can bring your own packaging. And like you had mentioned, you got goods in bulk. You bring your own packaging, you get 5 pounds of beans. I actually did that yesterday. I was getting cashews and almonds in a bulk store. So we're seeing these business models in the reuse economy, as well as smarter packaging and better systems of waste management in cities. And that's where I think we're seeing examples that are beginning to spread around the country. On an international stage, there's the UN Global Treaty that's being discussed right now. A year and a half ago, the UN decided to take up this challenge. There are going to be 3 negotiations. and then they'll vote on the treaty in 2024. So that I'm one of the scientific advisors to that treaty. There are about 80 of us, and it's inspiring. As long as we can keep the conversation about prevention, it's got to be legally binding about prevention, and it can't be voluntary and focus on just cleanup and recycling. It's got to be preventative and legally binding.
Now, you mentioned kind of the upstream issues. And one of the things that I see in my work is something that seems, sometimes just insurmountable, because there's a strong link between the use of fossil fuels, which is actually increasing now. I think last year was the biggest year for carbon production, and the production of plastics, and particularly fracking, which a lot of the byproducts of the fracking industry are used in plastic production, and that is kind of an economic driver for plastics production. And there's now all these cracking plants up and down the Ohio Valley and all over the country that are part of the food stream, the supply stream for plastics. And in fact, that train, I'm representing a lot of the people in East Palestine whose lives were upended by the Norfolk Southern train accident, the derailment. And that train was carrying vinyl chloride, which is, of course, one of the primary ingredients in the production of plastics. And those trains are going all day long through these communities across Ohio, and they're all involved. They're all connected. The fracking is connected to the vinyl chloride, which is linked to plastics production, and they're all part of this feed stream, for the industry that is driving more and more plastic production.
Yes, yeah, exactly. That train was carrying vinyl chloride. That's the building block of PVC. And those chemicals, as you said, they're moving around the country, moving around the world, everywhere we go. And some of those drivers we understand. There's a rising middle class worldwide that wants an increased quality of life that it comes highly packaged. A lot of products are plastic. Also, a lot of industries and technology are lightweighting their vehicles, lightweighting their products with plastic. So there are some key drivers, as well as a rising global population. By 2050, we could reach 9 to 10 billion people. And many of those, as they approach middle class, that's a big, big increase in demand for those materials.
What about recycling? Does it work?
It can if it's set up for success. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in conversations about recycling. And when I talk with folks that are producers, every stakeholder has a different perspective. The folks who make plastic, they really focus the conversation on the technology that's available. And they'll say they have these advanced recycling techniques, things called pyrolysis, waste to energy. They have all these technologies. And I often say, you throw enough money at it, you can recycle anything. You can recycle anything if we have the technology to do that. But to make it successful, the economics have to be there. And that's where the conversation almost always falls short. If you're going to recycle plastics, which is actually pretty efficient for PET, you got to have the infrastructure set up. But then to recycle it, you got to first collect it from the end of the road, from the consumer, back to a recycling hub, where then it gets washed, repelletized. Those pellets can go back into the market and get distributed. There's a lot of transportation costs as well. That is so much more expensive of a process than just getting the raw material, the raw feedstock from brand new petroleum, brand new ethylene coming from fracking stations. So it can't compete economically unless you set it up to compete. Therefore, I often tell industry folks, I say, well, if we're going to talk about recycling and how great the technology is, are you willing to support policy that's going to ensure that 75% or better of new products are containing at least 75% or more recycled plastics? You got to give it some market share, otherwise it can't compete. That's why recycling rates in the US are less than 10%. The other thing I would also add is design. We don't have any standards for designing to make recycling easy. If you look at products that were made a century ago, you could take apart any piece that broke and find that part and fix it. You could repair your own goods. Nowadays, you have a blender, one button breaks, and the whole thing becomes trash.
One of the things that you talked about is making the economics work, and I just want to suggest methodology for that, which is in many of the jurisdictions in Europe, the producer of products pays for the packaging, and pays for the recovery of that packaging. So if you send packaging out into the stream of commerce, you have to show that you've either reclaimed it, that you've recovered it, or you have to pay for its disposal. So the producer of the product actually pays for the packaging disposal. Oh, in Europe, you don't get a credit card that's tiny inside a shoebox filled with plastic peanuts or styrofoam peanuts, because whoever sent you that credit card is now going to have to pay for the disposal of all that packaging. And it works very well in Europe compared to what we have. What we do is we have the taxpayers subsidize that cost. It's not free market capitalism. It's an externality. And that's why we have landfills in all these communities. And it's because of a market failure. It's because the people who are causing the problem are not being forced to pay to clean it up. If you really want to have free market capitalism, actors in the marketplace should be paying for all of the costs of bringing their product to market, including the costs of cleaning up after themselves, which was a lesson we were all supposed to have learned in kindergarten. But they're able to evade that cost and escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay their production costs by putting all this crap out into the marketplace and knowing that the taxpayer is going to have to pay to recover it.
Those extended producer responsibility bills, they're so difficult to get through. I think the industry recognizes that is a threat to their bottom line. If the polluter has to pay, it can cost them potentially billions in having to be responsible for the end of life of their stuff. I mean, who captures those negative externalities? As you just said, it's a consumer, it's a taxpayer. And I can tell you myself and other middle-class Americans, we're tired of paying for landfills, tired of paying for roadside cleanup, for putting nets in rivers to capture trash or beach cleanups. It's not something that we should have to pay. I think the producer of the packaging, the products, should have skin in the game. But they've been very successful, as you know, deflecting those externalities that cost money. I'd be curious to know, how do we get a good EPR bill through?
Well, there's going to be tremendous resistance from the industry. We tried to do it a few years ago, and we got a couple of people from the industry who were willing to support it, including, strangely, Nestle, which, produces all these, Arrowhead water and Poland Springs water and local spring waters all over the country. But they try to get some of the other industry groups on board. But it's really the plastic producers that are blocking it, because they want the public to be stuck with paying the cost of the disposal of their trash, which makes no sense. I have to pay my trash get disposed. I have to pay the bill for my garbage being disposed, and those guys ought to do this, have to do the same thing.
I completely agree, and that's why I come back to the point. If Nestle, we can convince Nestle to say, would you be willing to help pass some legislation that all new water bottles that you make need to contain at least 75% recycled plastics? Create that market for recycling, because right now it doesn't exist. That's why it fails. The technology is there, but economic failure, unfortunately, is still present. I wonder if Nestle, if the other big beverage bottling companies, we can get them on the hook to at least buy back. If they're gonna message recycling, they got to set up for economic success. I mean, that'd be great producer responsibility, to willing to buy back your product and put it back in new bottles by law, so it levels the playing field across all companies making beverages out of plastics. I think that would go a long way to solving this.
What are some simple things that people can do to avoid ingesting plastic materials in their daily life?
Well, one thing is for an individual to not ingest plastic particles in their food and their drink. It's kind of hard to avoid. We have found microplastics in a lot of different bottled water. We found it in beer, in salt, in a lot of consumer products. You touch it and it perhaps makes this cloud of dust, like lint in your dryer. Those microfibers, we found those in human lungs. I think what you could do is just live a healthier lifestyle. You're eating organic, you're buying in bulk, you're going to a farmer's markets, bringing your own cloth bags, avoiding some of that plastic packaging. But I often tell people when they say, what can the individual do? I usually respond with, get organized. If this issue is something that you can get passionate about, there are others like you in your community. And I have seen so many small groups who go to city councils and demand change. And if you get students with you, young kids, I've never seen a council member tell a young kid to sit down. They will listen. So get organized and get what you believe, what you love in front of policymakers to make your local change. At the same time, decrease the amount of packaging in and around your home, around your family.
Thank you very much. It was really fun talking to you.
Likewise, my pleasure. Thanks for the time.
Is your lab open to, or your farm up there open to the public?
It is. It is. We have 15 acres. This farm, it was actually owned by Steve McQueen back in the late 80s. And he built a 4,000 square foot, he built this 4,000 square foot metal barn to house his car collection. I've now got it full of fossils and exhibits. We're building a small science center here in Ventura County where there isn't one. That's a side. Half my career is plastics, other half is informal science learning. So yeah, if you're passing through Ventura County, come on by.
Yeah, I will. And I saw that you collect fossils, and I go out periodically to South Dakota to the Pine Ridge Reservation, and
Okay.
and I have some paleontologist friends out there, and I do take my kids fossil hunting out there. It's fantastic, and I've also gone up to Alberta and found some amazing stuff. My son found a full saber-tooth head in South Dakota, a skull. Really, we go with a paleontologist called Japheth Boyce, who's right on the Wyoming border.
Huh. Up north, the border of Wyoming and South Dakota, or Wyoming and Montana?
Wyoming and South Dakota.
That's not too far from where I am. I've been digging in eastern Wyoming for about 30 years, every summer. I had a career diversion. Either I work on plastics or paleontology. So I chose not to be a paleontologist. You don't get a job until you wait till some professor dies. Then you can fill their shoes and get a job. But I chose to do this work, environmental work. But I've got in my garage, I've got 10 Triceratops skeletons. And we're going back the first 2 weeks in July. And if you're interested, we invite anyone to come out for 1 week at a time. I've got a Triceratops, a partial skeleton in the ground. And we're building a small science center here in Ventura County. I'm building another one in Lusk, Wyoming. I just bought an old car dealership, turned into a really funky roadside museum. It's about probably 2 hours from Mount Rushmore on the Wyoming side, of course. If you have a hankering to dig more.
I was at one point I was kind of researching about starting a program with the Sioux, because Pine Ridge, it's just like every time there's a rain in Pine Ridge, you have all these fossils just popping out of the ground, and they have everything. They have Pleistocene, the mega mammals all the way back. You have different kind of geological formations out there, and to try to train some of the young people on that reservation about how to find them, because now they're selling them, and there's money in them now, and it's like wealth that's just rotting on the ground every time it rains.
I saw that market change. I began doing this in the early 90s before Jurassic Park. And there I could trade with cowboys, ranchers out there. I could trade. I'd fix fence, I'd trail cattle, I'd dock sheep in exchange for collecting fossils. Now they want you to fix fence and give them, money per bone, which is fine because the eco tour. I did get some grant money to invite some kids here in Ventura County. I'm looking for, exceptionally science students. That the only barrier is economics. I can pay their way, but I've got some extra funding. If you know any students there in South Dakota on the reservation that want to come dig dinosaurs.
You know what? I'm going to look into that. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll send you a flyer on this year's expedition. And if you got students that are hungry for science, just ignore the fee on the flyer, and I'll take them out to the field. We've got a 7,000 acre ranch. Had about 25 people last summer. Last summer was great. I found a beautiful Triceratops upper arm bone, a beautiful turtle, and a T-Rex tooth. My second best T-Rex tooth ever was last summer.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it was good.
Really a pleasure to talk to you, Marcus.
Hey, Marcus, quick question. What kind of water do you drink? Do you filter it?
What's that?
Reverse osmosis? What do you do for your drinking water?
I've got a Brita filter I'm looking at, and I have my stainless steel bottles. On the junk raft, when I was floating across the ocean, I had a reverse osmosis pump, and I would spend the first 2 hours in the morning filling a 2-liter bottle with this pump for 2 hours to fill the bottle. And the next 2 hours, put it to my mouth and fill my body for 2 hours. That was every day for 3 months. middle of the ocean.
Oh,
Good fun.
Marcus Eriksen, how can people support you and how can they, follow you?
To go to our website, the Five Gyres Institute, that's the number 5, GYRES. We're doing a lot of work. We're an organization, we do the research, we publish the papers in peer-reviewed journals and bring that to the public, to policymakers, to industry, to say, look, here are the facts, what can we do? Now, I'll offer one quick anecdote. We're studying biomaterials now and finding so many innovative companies across the United States who are ready to replace plastics with biodegradable materials for thin film packaging. So I like to see research translate into real solutions, and that's what we're about. And again, it's 5gyres.org.
Marcus Eriksen, thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation to your podcast.